Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast, listener. Today, we're going deep. We're diving deep into a place and a history you might not know too much about. The Maghrib.
The Maghrib,
Yeah.
Northwest Africa,
Think Morocco,
Algeria,
Tunisia,
and Libya,
Libya.
that whole region.
Yeah, and you shared some excerpts from Jamil M. Abun-Nasr's A History of the Maghrib in the Islamic Period. And, we're not just going to be like, memorizing dates and names. No,
Yeah.
no. What we want to do is really understand, like, what made this region tick.
Yeah. What are the dynamics? What are the forces that shaped this incredibly dynamic part of the world?
Yeah, and see those recurring patterns, like, oh, this happened again. Oh, this happened again. You know what I mean?
Yeah. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes.
It rhymes. Yeah, exactly. And then maybe even see how this connects to stuff that's happening today.
That's right.
Yeah, so, like, we'll start with the basics, geography.
Yeah.
The Berber people, who were the original inhabitants.
Mhm.
Then we'll look at the arrival of Islam, the empires that rose and fell, both homegrown and, empires from further east.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, the impact of European colonialism.
Yeah, a huge turning point in the history of the region.
Huge. Yeah. So, listener, consider this your shortcut. Your, express train to understanding the Maghrib, a region that's often seen through a very, narrow lens.
Yeah, a lot of misconceptions out there.
Yeah. We're here to highlight the key insights, those aha moments.
That's right.
Without, boring you with too much detail.
We're not going to get lost in the weeds.
No. We'll give you the big picture.
Okay, let's start it.
Let's set the scene geographically.
Yeah.
So we really can't understand the Maghrib without appreciating the role of the Atlas Mountains.
The Atlas Mountains.
These mountains. Big mountains. They really are. They dominate the landscape and they dictate the climate. They dictate rainfall. You get these fertile zones in the north and west of Morocco.
Oh.
But then as you move south, it gets drier and you're edging into the Sahara. Right.
So these mountains really influence where people settled.
It's fascinating, right? How much geography plays such a fundamental role.
Absolutely.
And the book, it points out 3 specific geographical features
Okay.
that were really, really important.
Yeah.
The first one, the unreliable climate,
Yes.
its impact on farming.
Unpredictable rainfall.
Yeah.
So, relying on agriculture could be a bit precarious in many areas.
Right. So you couldn't always count on a good harvest.
That's right. So that kind of sets the stage for our second factor.
Okay. The extensive stepplands.
Huge grasslands.
Mm.
Perfect for grazing animals. But not so good for intensive cultivation.
Right.
So pastoralism, herding animals, becomes a dominant way of life in many parts of the Maghrib.
Right. Nomadic people.
Nomadic and semi-nomadic. Exactly.
Okay. And then the third thing.
The longitudinal nature of the geographical zones. They run east to west.
East to west.
Yeah, and coupled with the often difficult terrain that's made east-west movement, the author says almost useless and often difficult.
So it's hard to get around.
It is.
Okay.
And this helps explain why large unified agricultural communities and, by extension, centralized states were slow to develop in this area.
So power was more fragmented.
Exactly. More localized.
Now let's talk about the people who were there from the start, the Berbers.
The Berbers. Such a fascinating group of people.
Yeah.
Described as a composite people. Diverse origins.
Okay.
The most likely scenario, based on the evidence we have, is that they stemmed from migrations out of West Asia, way back in prehistoric times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there's even archaeological evidence suggesting contact with southwestern Europe, too.
So not just one homogenous group.
No, not at all. And as a consequence of these diverse origins, they didn't have a strong sense of unified Berber identity.
Right.
Their loyalty really was to their own tribe.
Their tribe comes first.
Absolutely. Almost never extending to this broader idea of a Berber nation.
So what, if anything, gave them any sense of shared identity?
Language.
Language, okay.
Classical writers, they called their language Libyan.
Libyan.
Today, we know it as Berber or Tamazight.
Okay.
And that linguistic connection is really the main basis for considering them as a single, albeit diverse group.
I mean, it is fascinating, though, how, these external pressures
Yeah.
sometimes, cause disparate groups to find common ground, even if it's just temporary.
For sure.
Yeah.
Even before the Arab conquest in the 7th century, these Berber tribal societies had developed ways to respond to threats from outside.
Right.
Sometimes they would form alliances with foreign powers.
Okay.
And they often create super tribal groups like these tribal confederations for mutual defense.
Strength in numbers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the book mentions Kusayla and Al-Kahina
Right.
led significant Berber resistance against the initial Arab invasion.
Right.
Later on, we see the Banu Ifran Confederacy.
Okay.
Another example of this pattern where they kind of come together in the face of a common threat.
It makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So that kind of sets the stage for, this big turning point, the arrival of Islam in the 7th century.
It was a huge turning point in the history of the Maghrib.
And it wasn't just, a military takeover.
Yep.
The book talks about how Islam really took root in Berber society because it became associated with these ideals of justice and religious equity.
Right.
And, the Berbers, they often felt that the Arab rulers were more focused on their own power and, the spoils of conquest than they were on actually living up to these Islamic ideals in their interactions with the Berbers.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about, religion being imposed. It actually connected with, existing values and grievances.
Tapped into something deeper.
Yeah.
A sense of fairness.
So they weren't just forced to convert.
Yeah.
It resonated with them on some level.
It did. And Berber rebellions against Arab rule, they were often framed in these Islamic terms.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they saw themselves as the true upholders of the faith,
Right.
correcting the failings of the Arab rulers.
The book even mentions a particular scholar who had this viewpoint,
Yes, Abu Zakaria,
Abu Zakaria.
a Kharijite scholar.
Oh,
The Kharijites, early Islamic sect with a distinctive set of beliefs. He was writing towards the end of the 11th century, and he cites hadiths, sayings, and traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad.
okay.
And these hadiths, they ascribe a special role to the Berbers
Okay.
in reviving and defending Islam.
Got it.
And he contrasts them with the Arabs, who he accuses of being more worldly,
Worldly.
more focused on material gains.
Material gain. Okay. But, the initial interactions weren't entirely, conflict.
Not at all.
Yeah.
You had a period of coexistence under leaders like Abu Muhajir and Kusayla.
Kusayla, the guy we talked about before.
The same one. He converted to Islam,
Okay.
initially maintained his authority,
Wow.
but then you get a more aggressive phase under Uqba ibn Nafi,
Okay.
who's driven by military ambition expansion,
Right.
wants to conquer new territory.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the legendary Al-Kahina,
Al-Kahina.
a woman who led the Berber resistance.
Wow.
Even when facing defeat, she reportedly sent her sons to the Arab side before her final battle.
Interesting.
She's a fascinating figure, ultimately defeated and killed in the Aras Mountains.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, her death really marked the end of that major organized Berber resistance during that initial phase.
Makes sense. But the establishment of Arab rule, this also led to the development of important urban centers, right?
Oh, absolutely. We start to see the creation of administrative hubs like Kairouan,
Kairouan.
which became a vital center for Arab caliphal administration in North Africa,
Okay.
and Tunis, strategically located for projecting Arab naval power in the Mediterranean.
Ah.
And it's interesting, they even brought in Coptic artisans from Egypt
Oh, wow.
to build ships.
To build ships.
Yeah,
Wow.
which highlights how important controlling the seas was at that time.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now let's fast forward a few centuries to the 11th century. This seems to be like a really crucial time when the whole political scene changed quite a bit.
Yeah, things really shifted. We see the emergence of Berber political leadership.
Berber leadership.
Yeah, and it lasts until the beginning of the 16th century. So you get the Almoravids, the Almohads, the Hafsids, the Marinids, the Zayanids,
Wow.
all these different dynasties,
Yeah.
all led by Berbers.
So the very people who resisted Arab rule now become the rulers.
Exactly. The tables have turned.
But even with Berber rulers, they still sought Islamic legitimacy.
Oh, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, even though they come from these Berber tribal backgrounds, these rulers, they really wanted that Islamic religious stamp of approval to bolster their authority.
Okay.
But the balance they struck between relying on tribal ties and Islamic institutions, that varied.
Oh, so like different dynasties had different approaches.
Yeah, exactly. For example, the Zayanids.
Yeah.
Tribal solidarity remained super important for them.
Much more so than for the Hafsids.
Yeah, Hafsids.
Yeah.
Okay. And what about the Marinids?
So the Marinids, they came to power through military conquest. They were this pastoralist tribal group.
Okay.
But as they consolidated their rule and settled down a bit, they started adopting more of the trappings of traditional Muslim rulers.
So they were kind of evolving.
Exactly. They were becoming more than just tribal chieftains.
So it sounds like, the whole nature of governance in the Maghrib was changing during this period.
Oh, it was. despite these Berber tribal origins, Islamic political culture continued to develop.
Okay.
So the relationship between the state and the tribes got more complex.
Right.
It wasn't just about tribal dominance anymore.
Okay.
Urban religious leaders, they started to play a bigger role.
So cities were growing.
Yeah. Urbanization
Okay.
and the ulama, the religious scholars.
Right.
They became increasingly important for legitimizing rulers.
Right. But of course, the Maghrib wasn't isolated.
No.
It had these close connections with other parts of the Islamic world,
Absolutely.
especially Al-Andalus.
Islamic Spain.
Islamic Spain.
Yeah, the ties were strong. The Umayyads of Cordova, even though they were ruling this Sunnite, Arab-dominated society in Spain,
Okay.
they couldn't ignore what was going on in the Maghrib.
Right.
They were even worried that the Abbasid Caliphate in the east might try to use the Maghrib as like a springboard to conquer Al-Andalus.
So they kept a close eye on things.
Oh, yeah, they had to.
So it's this constant back and forth across the Strait of Gibraltar.
They did
This dance of power and influence.
Right. And within the Maghrib itself, you eventually get a kind of political equilibrium.
Okay.
You have the Aqlabids, who represent Abbasid authority,
Right.
alongside these more independent local powers like the Rustamids
The Rustamids.
and the Idrisids.
Idrisids.
They each carve out their own spheres of influence.
So like a three-way split.
Yeah, sort of. And
Yeah.
what's interesting is that the Rustamids, they started out as Kharijite rebels,
Okay.
but then they kind of shifted to this policy of peaceful coexistence with their Sunnite neighbors.
So they mellowed out a bit.
They did. It was a pretty pragmatic move on their part.
It makes sense. But the situation in Al-Andalus, that also had repercussions for the Maghrib, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So you have this fragmented political landscape in Al-Andalus with the rise of the Muluk al-Tawaif.
The Muluk al-Tawaif.
Yeah, what historians call the party kings,
Party kings.
these smaller, independent Islamic rulers.
Okay.
And this weakened the Muslim hold on the Iberian Peninsula.
Right.
And it played right into the hands of their Christian rivals to the north.
Ah.
And eventually, some of these Muslim rulers in Spain were paying tribute to the Christian kingdom of Castile.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not a good situation. And this really sets the stage for the Almoravid intervention.
The Almoravids, another one of those key Berber groups.
Yeah, they came in from North Africa. They were a Sanhaj Berber confederation
Okay.
with really strong religious ideology. So their authority, it rested on both tribal strength and the influence of the fuqaha, the Islamic legal scholars.
Okay.
And their leader, Ibn Tashfin, he scored this big victory against the Castilians at the Battle of Zalaca.
So they were a force to be reckoned with.
They were.
Right.
But even though he takes control of Fez, which was this important center in Morocco,
Yeah.
he decides to establish a new capital at Marrakesh.
Marrakesh.
Yeah, and some scholars think this might reflect a certain distrust of the more settled urban communities.
Okay.
Maybe he saw them as less religiously zealous compared to his more austere, desert-based followers.
Makes sense. And then you have the Almohads,
Right.
who position themselves as reformers challenging the Almoravids.
That's right. So you have Ibn Tumart who starts this movement,
Okay.
and they see the Almoravids as having strayed from true Islam,
Okay.
and they want to set things right.
Interesting.
And Ibn Tumart, he eventually claims to be the Mahdi.
The Mahdi.
Yeah, the divinely guided figure.
Okay.
And he attracts a huge following, especially among the Mazmuda Berbers.
Okay.
And this movement eventually overthrows the Almoravids.
Wow.
Yeah, they were really powerful.
It's like empires rising and falling.
It is. It's a constant cycle. And the Almohads, they emphasize this really strict monotheism.
Okay.
They want to go back to what they see as the core tenets of Islam.
Okay.
And they reject certain legal interpretations in schools of law.
So like a purification of the faith.
Exactly.
Okay. Now let's jump way ahead
Okay.
to the 19th and early 20th centuries,
All right.
the age of European colonialism.
Yeah, a major turning point.
This is where things really change in the Maghrib, right?
It changes everything. The balance of power shifts dramatically.
Right.
So you have the French conquest of Algeria,
Starting in 1830.
1830.
Okay.
And it's marked by this really systematic dispossession of Algerian Muslims from their land.
So they're losing their homes.
They're losing their livelihoods.
Wow.
It's a very brutal process. And this includes habus lands.
Habus lands.
Yeah. Pious endowments dedicated to religious or charitable purposes.
Okay.
And communal tribal lands.
So it's like the foundation of their society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the French, they try to justify this using their own interpretations of Islamic law.
But
But the Algerians, they don't buy it.
Right.
They see it for what it is, a land grab.
A land grab. So it's a huge disruption of their, existing social and economic structures.
It is. And the European settlers, they gradually take control of vast tracts of land.
So they're pushing the Algerians out.
Yeah, they're taking over.
And this must have been so devastating for the local people.
It was. It led to widespread resentment,
Right.
and even uprisings like the one led by Muhammad al-Mukrani,
Okay.
which might have started with more limited goals.
Okay.
They quickly turn into these major rebellions against French rule.
So the anger just boils over.
It does. They're fighting to protect their way of life.
Right. And Tunisia also came under French control during this period.
Yeah. Becomes a French protectorate.
A protectorate.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Tunisian beys, the local rulers, they keep some semblance of authority.
Okay.
But their power is constantly being chipped away at
Right.
by European economic interests.
Okay.
And the French consuls,
Right.
who are really pulling the strings.
Right. So there are attempts at modernization and reform.
Yeah, things like the Ad al-Aman,
Alaman.
the Fundamental Pact,
The Fundamental Pact.
but ultimately it's not enough.
The French end up dominating.
They do.
And Morocco had a different experience, but the end result was the same, right?
Pretty much. Morocco, despite being this independent, traditional Islamic monarchy for centuries,
Right.
it also succumbs to European expansion.
Right.
So you have the French and Spanish protectorates established in 1912.
Wow.
Yeah,
And they had made some attempts at reform before that.
they had.
Mm.
But figures like Marshal Liachi, they play a key role in consolidating French control.
So the French, they were using different colonial strategies in different parts of the Maghrib.
Oh, yeah, they were adapting to local conditions. So in Morocco, for example, they implemented this thing called the Berber policy.
The Berber policy.
Yeah, and the idea was to cultivate a separate Berber identity,
Right.
distinct from Arab identity,
Yeah.
in the hopes of creating a population that's more open to French influence,
So divide and conquer.
essentially.
Yeah.
So they create these Franco-Berber schools.
Okay.
They try to promote French as the language of culture in some areas.
Okay.
And they even incorporate elements of Berber customary law into the French judicial system,
Interesting.
often at the expense of Islamic law.
So really trying to reshape the social fabric.
They were. And then you have Libya,
Libya.
which was under Ottoman control at the time,
Okay.
but it becomes a target of Italian expansion in the early 20th century.
Right.
And the Italians, they faced a lot of resistance,
Okay.
particularly from groups like the Sanusia.
The Sanusia.
Yeah, a prominent Sufi order in the region.
Right. But all this colonial rule, it inevitably leads to movements for independence.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So between the two world wars,
Right.
you see this rise of nationalist movements across the Maghrib.
Okay.
And in Algeria, you have both conservative Muslim leaders
Right.
who want to preserve Islamic identity
Okay.
and French-educated evil.
I'll use.
Yeah, they're kind of like the assimilated elite
Okay.
who are pushing for more political rights,
Right.
but they have different visions for the future.
So it's not a unified movement.
No,
Okay.
there are tensions and disagreements.
And what about Tunisia?
So Tunisia's nationalist movement, it grows out of these early anti-colonial sentiments,
Okay.
and it develops into this really strong movement
Right.
with the Neo-Destor Party at the forefront.
The Neo-Destor Party.
Yeah, and they represent this new generation of Tunisian elites
Okay.
educated in these Franco-Arab schools,
Okay.
and they play a big role in mobilizing the population
Right.
and ultimately achieving independence.
Right. And then there's Morocco.
Right. Moroccan nationalism also gains momentum,
Okay.
and it's fueled by this growing perception that the protectorate's policies are really just benefiting the Europeans
Right.
at the expense of Moroccans.
Okay.
So in the 1930s, they present this plan of reform,
A plan of reform.
well, an attempt to address some of these grievances.
Okay.
But the French basically ignore it.
Ah.
And then things really heat up in 1953 when the French depose Sultan Mohammed V.
Wow.
Yeah, this really galvanizes the nationalist movement and leads to widespread resistance.
So it's like a rallying cry.
It is. They're not going to take it anymore.
Right. And Algeria's struggle for independence, that was particularly long and violent.
Oh, yeah, the Algerian Revolution,
Starting in 54.
54.
Okay.
And it goes on for 8 long years.
Wow.
Brutal war.
Right.
But they finally achieve independence in 62.
62.
Yeah, and you see this real regional solidarity
Oh.
at the Tangier Conference in 58.
Tangier Conference.
Yeah, where Morocco and Tunisia, They pledged their support for the Algerian struggle.
So they're coming together.
Yeah, they're united against colonialism.
And Libya.
So Libya actually gains independence earlier in 51.
It's 51.
Yeah, initially as 3 separate provinces.
Okay.
But they eventually unify into a single kingdom.
Right.
And, of course, the discovery of oil.
Ah.
That really transforms the country.
Right.
And the rise of Arab nationalism in the decades that follow, that also plays a big role in shaping Libya's post-independence trajectory.
Okay. So, listener, as you can see, the history of the Maghrib, it's this incredibly rich and complex tapestry.
It is. It's fascinating.
It's woven with the threads of indigenous Berber cultures, the influence of Islam, the rise and fall of empires, both local and foreign, and then the impact of European colonialism, which was so disruptive.
Absolutely.
You know, we've journeyed through centuries.
We have.
We've looked at key figures, pivotal events, and tried to understand the forces that shape this region.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. From those early geographical challenges.
Yeah.
The Berber resistance to the complex politics of the Berber-led empires, and then those hard-fought struggles for independence in the 20th century.
Yeah, there's so much depth and complexity.
There is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
So here's what I'm curious about.
Okay.
Listener, what stands out to you as the most significant thing? Is it the resilience of Berber identity? You know, after centuries of external influence. Or maybe it's the power of religious ideas in shaping both conflict and cooperation. Or maybe it's the lasting impact of colonialism.
Yeah, which is still felt today.
So this brief exploration, it's just a starting point.
It is. There's so many more stories to tell.
There are.
Individual experiences to uncover. Nuances to explore.
So what does this all mean for you? For your understanding of the world, hopefully it gives you a new perspective.
Yeah, a more nuanced understanding.
Yeah, of this vital and often misunderstood region and how it's continuing to evolve.
Absolutely.
And one final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
So we've seen this long history of external influences interacting with internal social and political forces in the Maghrib.
Right.
How might these patterns continue to shape the region's challenges and opportunities in the 21st century?
That's a big question.
It is. Something to think about.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, listener.